Hello class, and welcome to another lecture. Today we're getting into Revelation. You watched the Bible Project Introduction to Revelation, which was just the first 11 chapters. But we're going to get into it a little bit more and kind of talk about this book as a whole. It's oftentimes kind of, avoided. Let me share a little bit of my personal experience. The first time I remember really as an introduction to this book, when I was a really young kid, I was probably maybe 5, maybe 4 even. I remember this memory so well because it was a little bit scary. Our church at the time was doing a Bible study on Revelation. And when I say Bible study, I really mean that loosely because they were really just watching a movie and not really talking about the book as so much. Now, you might have heard of the movies Left Behind and all that. There were some ones that were earlier than that, actually from the 70s, before I was even born, okay? And that's what my church was watching. They were kind of outdated, but they were the films of the time. And it was called A Thief in the Night. This really old 70s, end of the world, very kind of like Jesus is out to get you kind of movie, almost like version of, like God's mad and now all this is going to happen. So brace yourself because God's coming down to play the smackdown kind of thing. All right, so what happened is actually because this was really not meant for children, this movie, kids were off playing. We were just kind of being watched by somebody there, right? So I'm off in another room, but I needed something from my mom. That's all I remember. And I was allowed to sneak out, I guess, and go find my mom and ask her a question or something. I don't even remember what I was doing. But I happened to glance at the video for just a second. And this was the scene I saw. It had already been to the point where Jesus had returned and people were raptured and whatever. And there were people left behind. And now there were people that were converting, the people left behind, they were converting to Christianity and finding that what they had missed was Jesus. And people who had, instead of receiving the mark of the beast, the number 666, if they refused to receive that, they would be beheaded. And there was this big guillotine that would just behead people, and it was like gruesome, right? Guess what scene I walked in on? The scene I saw was one of these Christians being beheaded, like right there as a 4-year-old, right? 5-year-old, somewhere around there. Terrifying. And I was told that this is what happens when Jesus returns. This guy was a Christian, he's getting killed. I mean, it was scary. So I immediately had this connotation for quite some time, even into my teen years, that the book of Revelation was to be avoided because it was terrifying. And if I read it, I would see how angry God was. That's not what this book's about. Unfortunately, that's still kind of a stigma. And unfortunately, a lot of people still avoid this book because they really don't see it as it truly is. Now, last year, 8th graders, we talked a lot about the prophets, whether major prophets or minor prophets. And there was this term, the day of the Lord, that showed up a lot, okay? And it oftentimes meant judgment, yes, like God's not happy with the way that people are listening to him. They're not keeping the commandments, right? They're disobeying, they're worshiping false idols and gods and so on. And God's judgment, the day of the Lord, is going to show up. But the day of the Lord also refers to redemption and salvation. And so there's this odd blend between a God who says, I'm not going to allow sin to just reign. I'm not going to just allow sin to do its thing and ruin everything that God created that was meant to be perfect and pure and holy. But at the same time, where God's judgment is there, God's also bringing about a plan of salvation. We see this perfectly in the person of Jesus Christ. When Jesus sits down with somebody, maybe he eats around a table with sinners. Like he was oftentimes criticized of eating and fellowshipping with sinners and these, people that no one wanted anything to do with, right? Jesus was oftentimes compassionate, but also spoke the truth. And so there was this blend of grace and truth. This is the God that we serve. A God who says, listen, my definition of truth is the only definition. but I also love you unconditionally. That's a weird tension there at times. You know, it's like saying to someone, listen, I don't always agree with what you're doing, but I love you as you are. So much so that I want you to change to be who you could be. And that's the challenge here, even with Revelation, is that God is saying, listen, I have the ultimate final say. This world as you see it now will not remain as it is. It will not remain broken because of sin forever. There will be a restoration, a renewal of it. And that's going to happen when Christ returns. And so, really our objective here is to kind of talk about Revelation as a book of worship. Not a book of doom and gloom, a book that needs to be avoided at all costs, a book that just simply kind of just keeps you up at night because it's some kind of horror story. No, rather a book that is about a God who so voraciously loves you and I, and everything else he created, not even just human beings, but everything that is affected by sin and death. He is about the process of redemption and restoration through his perfect and unending love. And that is really good news. See, Revelation isn't just kind of some random book that like doesn't fit in with the rest of Scripture. It's not like this God who's like, I've had enough, I'm just going to lay the smack down. No, this is a God who's consistently loving his people and trying to urgently bring them back to the garden, back to a place where there is perfect relationship between us and creation and us and God. All right, let's get into some of the details, okay? Now that we've kind of talked about what it is and what it is not, okay? Authorship, all right? Authorship, date, and those who are reading this book. Okay, so the audience. The author of Revelation is designated as John. He is a prophet. There's two Johns that are prophets in the New Testament. John the Baptist, who prepares the way for Jesus. And then we have John here in Revelation, who is predicting the second coming of Jesus, in a way preparing for Christ to return. Very similar to John the Baptist, in fact. Different person, though. Different John. There's lots of Johns. It's a very common name. Some scholars date Revelation to the time of Emperor Nero. Nero, you've probably studied a little bit in history class, and we've talked about him here and there. But he was one of the cruelest emperors towards Christians, particularly, and to Jews as well. This probably would have happened after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So it's right around that time when there's a revolt happening. There's just a lot of tensions between Jewish groups, Jewish and Christian groups, and Rome. So this is just not a comfortable time. Lots of persecution happening, lots of just tension between this new religion, Christianity, and Rome and the emperor. All that to say, the book certainly alludes to the fact that these Christians that John is writing to are in fact facing persecution. And so a lot of these words are comfort to say, listen, the day of the Lord means that God has heard you. God is a God who always hears the cries of this people. And he's going to respond to that. Not just simply, oh, I heard you, right? But I'm going to respond and actually do something about it. So there are 7 churches that are actually written. So this book, even though it's pretty large in size, it's actually more of a letter. It's written to 7 different churches. And you'll see that these 7 different churches have slightly different things that the author's trying to say to them. You know, they each have a particular need or a particular circumstance that they're facing. We have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Okay, so these are all there. I'll have a map here showing where all these places are. They're all around the same area, what would be modern-day Turkey. So as far as the style of writing, it's kind of unique. The language or the style of writing, the literature here is not completely unique to just this book, Revelation, but it's an odd blend of things. You know, we're going to see some apocalyptic language, which is very similar to a lot of the language found in books like Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah even, Isaiah even. some of the prophets. Again, John's a prophet, so he's speaking as a prophet would. So the book of Revelation contains three particular styles of writing. We have prophecy, which proclaims and reveals God's plan for the future. So this is future predictions. It's also a letter. It resembles very much the letters that like Paul would write or any other writers in the New Testament. It's also apocalyptic. That's the main one that most people focus on. But really, it's also prophecy and letter. Apocalyptic uses these vivid images and symbols looking forward to the future intervention of God into history, right? God speaking into history. You know, we have a lot of things that happen in our culture and history, and and a lot of those are mostly human controlled, right? You know, somebody does this and it affects history, right? These are our leaders, these are the events, these are the things that happen in history that we study. But then as followers of Jesus, we also know that God intervenes at crucial moments in time to change the course of human history. You know, that's exactly what Jesus Christ did. When Christ was born, when Jesus was born, it changed the course of human history. And so when Christ returns, it is once again going to change the course of human history. It's unique in the way it's written because it is such a beautiful blend of this prophecy and letter and apocalyptic language. It's a blend of all those. And it kind of is difficult to read. This is why there's probably been more books written about this one single book of the Bible than probably any other book, right? Between Revelation and probably Genesis, the first chapters of Genesis at least, probably have been more books written. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about today here is that when you see John, the writer here, say something apocalyptic, say something that's like has symbolism in it, right? He sees this. It's going to say that he goes into the Spirit, or he's being in the Spirit. In other words, God is going to show this to him, right? Pay attention to that, as you maybe even read the other day, that this is from God. This is not just what John's seeing, right, on his own. This is not just something from John's imagination, but this is what God is showing him, okay? And also at the same time, understand that prophets like John are just human beings like you and I. They're not supernatural. Now God, what God is doing is supernatural. And so these images are kind of difficult. And the way I read it is that these are symbolic to a truth, a greater truth than John, or like us, if we were putting ourselves in John's shoes, right, that we could not handle. In other words, there is so much perfection in God's truth. And because of our sin and because of our humanness, we cannot completely comprehend or understand or even contain all of God's perfect truth. Okay? And so God uses symbols. God uses something abstract in a way to help us see the bigger truth of what God is, right? We saw this, like, say, for instance, in the book of Job. When God shows Job at the end of the book, after Job suffered all this, right? He's gone through all this suffering, all this heartache. When God showed Job this sort of cosmic whirlwind of a virtual tour of the universe, he didn't show him everything. He showed him just glimpses of things and began to tell him there's so much more that you don't see and that you won't understand even if I told you. That's a paraphrase. But that's true, isn't it? And I think if God were to say to John, this writer of Revelation, that, hey, here's everything you would, like John's head would just like emoji explosion, right? Like that, you know, I'm talking about the emoji with the blowing up the head. Yeah. All right. So that would have been John. That's us too. And so God brings us where we are, right? Because God is a God of patience and love. And God takes us where we are and is going to show us what God's truth is and God's perfect plan. And that is it for now. All right. We're going to pick up the next lesson. Until then.